At my parents' anniversary party, my brother mocked me again, calling me just a paper pusher in uniform in front of everyone. They laughed. I stayed silent. But just as I was about to leave, the door opened, and his daughter, dressed in full pilot uniform, walked in and saluted me. That moment changed everything. And if you've ever felt unseen, underestimated, or like the black sheep in your own family, this story might be the closure you never knew you needed. The grand ballroom in Bellevue was glowing under soft strings of lights, every detail carefully arranged to mark 35 years of Stephen and Linda Collins's marriage. Long banquet tables dressed in ivory linens and candlelight stretched across the room. Crystal glasses sparkled. A live jazz trio played softly in the corner. Guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses milled about, raising flutes of champagne. At the center of it all stood the celebratory couple, Stephen dignified in a tailored suit, and Linda radiant in a deep azure evening gown. Friends and family circled around them, offering toasts and laughter. It was everything a milestone anniversary should be: warm, festive, and flush with affection. It was also, for one man in navy uniform at the back of the room, a reminder of how small he still felt. Jason Collins stood by the window, shoulders squared but demeanor measured. At 32, he was a man hardened both by training and internal restraint. His uniform bore the distinctive patches of a U.S. military intelligence officer, patches no one here would recognize, least of all his own family. He'd flown in 5 days ago from a classified mission overseas, back home for the first time in months, and the swirling crowds and bubble of acclaim all around left him oddly adrift, because to them, his mother, his father, his older brother, he was exactly who he appeared to be. A soldier assigned to desk duty. That was the shorthand everyone used. He'd great-aunt's gentle question over a flute of champagne. So Jason's still doing that army paperwork. It wasn't meant to wound, but it stung like sit in an open wound. In his blazer pocket, beneath the patriotic ribbons and medals, was a night vision photo showing him kneeling beside a wounded civilian. It was never going to be shared at a party like this. And he nodded politely instead of correcting the misconception. A few feet away, Michael Collins, his elder brother, held court. He was the portrait of success, crisp navy suit, crisp smile, holder of a prestigious real estate title. That first job after college, the one he'd built into a major development firm, had obliterated any lingering expectations of mediocrity. Now he basked in attention, his name on magazine covers, his projects anchored in headlines, his confidence, a kind of echo that reverberated through the room. With wine in hand, he toasted his parents, how they had shaped him, raised him, lionized him. There was laughter on all sides, applause, and clearly this was Michael's moment. And there stood Jason, half invisible. He could hear the undertone of pride that warmed Stephen's voice when he accepted Michael's toast. He could see Linda's hand resting tenderly on Michael's shoulder while she beamed at him. But Linda gave Jason a polite smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "Jason, dear, tell me, how's the army life? Any major promotions?" The tone was casual, but the implied message was brutal. "Your uniform doesn't matter in here." He took a measured sip of water, placing the glass aside. He wasn't boastful, and he understood secrecy. He lived under orders not to speak of specifics, especially in civilian settings. But even as he remained quiet, he felt each implication echo in his gut. He wasn't enough to mention by name. A hush rippled through the guests as Stephen cleared his throat. He gestured toward his wife, then Michael, recounting Michael's ascent from valedictorian to CEO in under a decade, from college football captain to a husband and father building his own empire. Applause followed. The spotlight shifted and hands raised glasses. Meanwhile, Jason was guided toward a seat at the end of the table, significantly removed from his brother, placed next to his cousin's fiancé, a man he barely knew. Michael shot Jason a nod from afar, quick and courteous. Words unspoken passed between them of solidarity among siblings, but Jason felt the space widen, an emotional chasm opened by pride, distance, and years of unspoken disappointment. The dinner began. Linda leaned across to the guest beside her and mimed army desk jockey, rolling her eyes toward Jason with such casual disdain that it might have gone unnoticed had Jason not been watching. He caught her glance, the same one he'd seen since he was 8 years old. Stephen asked the nearest guest about job prospects in California, and that was that. No follow-up for Jason's own story. Not tonight, not ever. But Jason had practiced silence. He knew that heading into this weekend, heart clenched tight, he'd find his place at the table, even if it had to be in the shadows of others. He glanced out the window. Rain threatened low and misting over Bellevue Point. Beyond the celebratory clatter, that window gave him a view of what he'd been fighting for, the security of home. A familiar skyline he'd protected in secret. On the way here, he'd closed his eyes and thought of that mission, one that had kept him awake for weeks, that had cost him nights and sleep, and a promise that very few would ever know. But still, he had an unwavering sense of purpose. That alone felt like the only control he'd ever had in this room. Around the table, toasts were offered, laughter bloomed, plates were cleared, wine glasses refilled. Michael raised his glass to the crowd, praising his mother. Applause followed again. Garlanded by odd cheers and affections, he smiled. Michael looked at ease in his constellation of admirers. Jason looked down at his folded napkin. His fingertips brushed the silverware. He considered making a joke light and self-deprecating. But no, an old conditioning came back. Stay quiet and observe. Don't exhale until you're ready. He lifted his chin. Dinner would progress. Conversations would come. He would not crumble. But he remained unseen, by design, by choice, and by necessity. And so it began, a night that unfolded like a polished stage play, with brothers cast in different roles. Michael the heir, the hero, the visible one. Jason the unseen protector, the one who could rescue a helicopter full of lives, but still was unremarked in this ballroom. He straightened his uniform again, standing a little taller. Maybe by night's end they'd notice. But maybe it wouldn't matter anymore. Jason's earliest memories were quiet ones, soft corners of rooms. Books opened alone, voices speaking over him rather than to him. There were birthday parties where the spotlight seemed to tilt away, school assemblies where claps came louder for someone else's name. That someone almost always was Michael. From the very beginning, Michael had been a beacon, loud, charismatic, effortlessly likable. He was the golden boy who played varsity soccer, brought home trophies from debate club, and smiled in school yearbooks with the confidence of a boy who had never known what it meant to be ignored. His report cards were decorated with superlatives. Teachers called him a natural leader, and neighbors referred to him as that talented Collins boy. Jason, 2 years younger, learned early how little space there was in a house already lit by someone else's brilliance. He wasn't jealous, at least not then, but he was acutely aware. At home, Linda would recount Michael's achievements at the dinner table like headlines. Michael was named class speaker again, or the coach said Michael should try out for state. Her eyes sparkled when she said his name. When Jason brought home a perfect score on a science exam, Linda nodded and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning to Stephen to talk about Michael's upcoming game. Stephen. Their father was a practical man, quiet and focused, an engineer who believed in results but rarely expressed praise. If Jason wasn't failing, Stephen didn't worry. And if Michael was succeeding, that was reason enough to celebrate. Jason was different. He didn't seek attention. He didn't know how. What he had was a mind that gravitated toward patterns, toward solving puzzles, building intricate models out of old computer parts, and asking questions far beyond his grade level. He memorized constellations, learned Morse code before age 10, and once coded a weather tracker on an outdated laptop. But his world was quiet, and in the Collins household, quiet wasn't something people noticed. At school, Jason's teachers tried to advocate for him. "He's incredibly gifted," one wrote on a report, perhaps even advanced beyond his age group. But when Linda read the comment, she merely said, "That's lovely. Let's not push him too hard, he's delicate." The word stuck. Delicate, as if his strengths were frailties, as if thoughtfulness were weakness. Michael, on the other hand, was bold. He made friends easily, spoke confidently, and brought home group photos that Jason was never invited to be part of. The two brothers didn't fight. They simply orbited in different worlds. Occasionally, Michael would ruffle Jason's hair and say, "Come to the field sometime, bro." You could use the exercise, which, though offered lightly, always landed like a reminder Jason was outside the circle. Then came the 5th grade science fair. Jason had built a working model of a geothermal energy converter. It wasn't flashy, but it was complex, real engineering adapted to scale. He'd spent weeks calculating energy output, testing it on recycled materials, even presenting his findings to his teacher with graphs and formulas. Michael, in 9th grade, then had just won the district speech competition. The same week, the school announced Jason's science fair win. The family celebrated Michael's return from the debate tournament. At dinner, Linda placed a "Congratulations, Michael" banner across the kitchen. Stephen made his favorite ribs. There were cheers, wine, and Michael retelling the speech in the living room like a victory monologue. Jason's trophy sat on the edge of the dining table unnoticed. He didn't mention it. Later that night, he took the trophy and placed it in the back of his closet. It wasn't a moment of anger, it was a moment of understanding. One of many. A slow accumulation of unspoken lessons that Michael was the kind of son people talked about in glowing terms. Jason was the kind they nodded at politely. The pattern continued through high school. Jason joined robotics club, won regional math competitions, and volunteered at the local science museum. When he mentioned these things at dinner, Linda would smile vaguely, then ask Michael about his girlfriend or the upcoming football season. Michael wasn't cruel. In fact, he was mostly indifferent. When Jason showed him a homemade drone prototype, Michael said, "That's cool, little bro," before turning back to his phone. It wasn't disdain, it was dismissal, which somehow was worse. In those formative years, Jason began to build walls. He stopped mentioning his projects. He grew comfortable in the library and solitude in letting Michael shine. In family photos, he stood at the edges. At school events, he preferred the back row. He convinced himself that recognition didn't matter, that solitude was safety. But there was a hunger beneath it, a quiet, aching need to be seen, not as a reflection of Michael, not as a quirky genius, but as himself, a person of worth, a boy who wanted his parents to look at him and feel not surprise. He remembered once, just once, his father had pulled him aside after Jason had fixed the home Wi-Fi by rerouting the firmware manually. "You're smart," Stephen had said. "You'll probably do something with computers." Jason had smiled, heart racing, waiting for more. But Stephen had already turned back to the game on TV. By the time Jason turned 18, he had mastered the art of invisibility. He applied to college, quietly chose a state school with a modest scholarship, and packed his bags without fanfare. No send-off party, no goodbye dinner. Michael was preparing for a corporate internship that summer, and the household energy had shifted entirely toward his future. Jason sat on the train to college with a duffel bag, a thermos of coffee, and a handwritten list of goals folded in his pocket. At the top of that list, be someone that matters even if no one knows it. Jason didn't plan to join the military. It hadn't been on his list of ambitions or scribbled into the margins of his college notebooks. But the idea took root one rainy Tuesday in his sophomore year when he wandered into a public lecture hosted by a visiting veteran retired Master Sergeant Gabriel Haynes. The event was sparsely attended, mostly ROTC students and a few curious passers-by. Jason hadn't intended to stay more than 5 minutes. And yet something about the man's presence, his calm authority, his way of speaking without dramatics held Jason in his seat. Haynes spoke not of glory or medals, but of precision, of decisions made under pressure, of reading a battlefield not by instinct but by logic. He described how intelligence saved lives long before the first boots hit the ground. The smartest people I served with, he said, weren't always the strongest. They were the ones who could see the threat before anyone else did. Jason felt something click. Afterward, he lingered. They spoke briefly. Haynes asked what Jason was studying, mathematics and systems science, and raised an eyebrow. "The military needs people who can think like you," he said. It was the first time someone had ever told Jason that his mind could serve a greater purpose, that he wasn't just clever in theory but valuable in the real world. 2 weeks later, Jason walked into a recruiting office and signed the paperwork. When he told his family over dinner that summer, the reaction was swift and cold. "You're doing what Linda asked," her fork paused midair. "Enlisting," Jason said. "I'm hoping to move toward intelligence work, long term." Michael burst out laughing. "What, you're gonna go be a computer geek in camo?" Jason kept his tone even. "It's a little more involved than that," Linda frowned. "Jason, sweetheart, you have a degree. You're meant for more. Don't lower yourself." Stephen cleared his throat. "Military life's not for everyone. You sure this isn't just a phase?" "It's not," Jason replied. Stephen gave a small nod but then turned to Michael. "Did you golf this weekend with the Hensleys?" The subject changed. Jason said nothing more. What followed were months of basic training, brutal, relentless, unyielding. Jason was not the strongest in his unit. He didn't have the loudest voice or the best aim, but he didn't quit. When others dropped during endurance drills, he pushed through. When confusion broke among squads, Jason was the one drawing out diagrams in the dirt, finding the pattern. Instructors noticed. He didn't speak unless necessary, but when he did, his questions cut to the core of problems. He didn't act rashly, but when asked to make a call, he calculated faster than anyone else. Soon after, he was routed toward the analytical track, eventually landing in the defense intelligence field. He aced every cognitive battery, his aptitude for systems modeling and real-time risk forecasting catching the eye of a senior operations director. Within 18 months, Jason was embedded within a Black Ops Think unit specializing in asymmetrical warfare scenarios. From that point forward, he was no longer training, he was deploying. His job wasn't on the front lines. It was in bunkers, makeshift bases, mobile command stations. He translated satellite data, intercepted chatter, coordinated evacuations under fire. More than once, his forecasts saved lives, flights rerouted before ambushes, squads redirected away from IED traps. He had a growing record of commendations. He had been promoted faster than expected, and yet he never told his family. He sent the occasional message, "Doing well, stationed abroad." "Work's intense but meaningful." Linda would reply with a thumbs-up emoji or a generic "glad to hear, dear." Michael once joked via text, still doing computer puzzles in the desert. Stephen rarely messaged at all. Jason stopped trying. He didn't tell them when he was promoted to major. He didn't mention the medal he received for strategic valor awarded in a private Pentagon ceremony. He didn't tell them he'd been offered a liaison role at the NATO Intelligence Center. Because he could already hear it, the half-laugh from Michael, the dismissive nod from Linda, the polite shrug from Stephen. So he let it all sit in silence. It was easier. He convinced himself that the work mattered regardless of whether they knew, that the lives he helped protect outweighed the family that wouldn't understand. But every now and then at night or in the quiet lull between assignments, he felt it. The ache of being invisible to the people who were supposed to see him first, and still he returned home when he could. He attended the occasional family holiday. He wore neutral clothing. He listened while Michael talked about his real estate expansions and international clients. He let Linda brag about Michael's latest magazine feature and Stephen compare golf handicaps. He never corrected them when they asked vaguely, still working base ops. He never said, I've been working strategic recon for operations you read about in the news. He never said, I saved people. I saved more than you'll ever know. Because the words felt too heavy and he had grown used to carrying them alone. The desert air was brittle that night, tinged with the iron scent of coming rain and the electric buzz of satellite relay towers. Jason sat behind a bank of monitors in an underground base just east of an undisclosed conflict zone, his eyes scanning the live feed from a drone hovering 40,000 feet above the earth. He zoomed in 2 heat signatures insurgents on a ridgeline. One of them held what looked like a shoulder-mounted missile. 30 seconds later, the crosshairs caught a convoy moving through a ravine, a U.S. platoon en route Delta. He made the call. Redirect Echo Unit 7 north to Route Lima. Immediate reroute. Hostile presence confirmed on Delta. The voice on the other end didn't ask questions. Jason's intel was trusted. Minutes later, the platoon cleared the ridge just before the insurgents struck. Lives were spared. Jason didn't flinch, didn't even pause. He moved on to the next feed. These moments weren't rare, they were constant. Over and over, Jason analyzed patterns, intercepted comms, drew conclusions with little margin for error. One miscalculation could mean 20 soldiers never coming home. And still, he was never out front, never in headlines. That wasn't his job. The work was meticulous and thankless, but he was built for it. Over time, Jason earned the quiet respect of commanders who rarely gave praise. But one person always said it out loud, Sam Mitchell. Sam had been his colleague since their first joint rotation at a NATO base in Germany. She was quick-witted, blunt, and fiercely competent, one of the few who matched his rhythm in field assessments. Where others dismissed Jason as the quiet type, Sam read his silence as focus. You're the one writing the chess moves before anyone even sees the board, she once told him. They'd worked together in Jordan, Kosovo, and South Korea. They had each other's backs, not in the traditional bullets-flying sense, but in the moral and mental trenches of intelligence warfare. Then came the mission in Kandahar. A squadron of pilots had been deployed to exfiltrate a stranded Allied team near the border. The mission had already been greenlit when Jason caught a data anomaly patterns in local mobile traffic suggesting an ambush plan buried beneath misleading chatter. He flagged it, pulled a double shift and overlaid historical insurgent routes with the projected flight path. There was a 92% chance they'd fly straight into a trap. Jason requested an immediate reanalysis. The window was short, less than 40 minutes until takeoff. He pushed the findings to Sam, who confirmed it within 20 minutes. They rerouted the flight. The exfil team adjusted position. The ambush was avoided. No one on the squadron ever knew how close they'd come. It wasn't until 3 days later that Jason scanned the flight manifest and saw a name he recognized. Danielle Collins, U.S. Air Force lieutenant. His niece, Michael's daughter. Jason stared at the screen. She looked so much like Michael in the old family albums, but with softer edges, earnest eyes. He hadn't seen her in years, only at family holidays where she sat near Michael, quiet but respectful. They had never spoken much. He closed the file and never said a word. He didn't tell Michael. He didn't write to Danielle. He didn't tell Sam either. He filed it in the vault where he kept the rest of his unsung decisions. Because that was the work. That was the life. Jason returned home a few months later for a holiday dinner. His family greeted him with polite indifference. Danielle was absent training, Michael said. Linda brought out wine. Stephen mentioned a recent article about military office work automation and joked that Jason's job might soon be obsolete. Jason smiled faintly. Maybe someday. He never brought up Kandahar. Linda asked if he was still tracking weather maps or whatever they make you do. Michael leaned in. You ever gonna get deployed somewhere cool or just keeping your seat warm in some command closet? Jason didn't correct them. That night he sat in the guest room reading Danielle's flight report on a secure server from his laptop. He reread the part where her squad executed evasive maneuvers. She had signed off with professional clarity, completely unaware that the man who diverted her route was sitting in the next room being called a desk jockey. Sam would later ask him, "Why don't you ever let them see what you've done?" Jason shrugged. "It's classified." She rolled her eyes. Some things aren't, like your spine. But Jason wasn't afraid. He was tired. Of explaining, of justifying, of chasing recognition from people who had already decided what he was. He preferred saving lives quietly. Sam understood that. She didn't push again. But sometimes in the hours after a mission, she'd pass him a drink and raise her glass, not to the intel, not to the numbers, but to him. To the guy who sees what no one else does, she'd say. Jason appreciated that more than any medal. And yet, despite all he'd done, the title that followed him into family dinners was still the same paper soldier. Back office military, man in uniform with nothing important to say. It didn't hurt the same way anymore. It numbed. But every so often, especially on quiet nights, Jason remembered Danielle's name on that manifest, and he remembered what would have happened if he'd done nothing. She was alive. That was enough. He folded the moment into the long archive of invisible victories. And kept going. The clink of glasses echoed like punctuation marks around the long anniversary table. Warm lights shimmered on crystal, laughter rolled gently from one end to the other. Jason sat near the far edge, his seat positioned more by obligation than inclusion. The dining hall had been carefully arranged by Linda, who had a knack for elegant distancing, her way of preserving the spotlight for Michael while keeping others in the periphery. The plates had just been cleared when Michael stood to speak, one hand gripping a glass of Cabernet, the other gesturing with the practiced charm of a man used to attention. 35 years he began of love, of building something real, of watching our family grow. I think we can all agree Mom and Dad did something right. Scattered applause. Michael smirked, scanning the room. And hey, some of us even turned out okay, right, Chuckles? People leaned in, expecting a joke. Take my little brother Jason, Michael said, lifting his glass slightly toward Jason's end of the table. Still rocking the uniform, still shuffling papers in the Pentagon or wherever they keep the quiet types. A few guests laughed, not maliciously, just awkwardly uncertain but encouraged by Michael's tone. He's our mystery man, Michael continued, eyes twinkling. Never really sure what he does, but he wears it well. Just don't ask him to build anything or run a mile. Bigger laughs now. Jason felt his chest tighten, but he smiled politely, eyes lowering to his folded napkin. Linda leaned in from her seat beside Stephen. Oh, he's always been so humble, she said, her voice lilting with that peculiar edge, a kind of condescending admiration. Jason's the type who's just content behind the scenes. Stephen gave a vague chuckle. You know, some people enjoy the quieter paths. Not everyone wants the stress of business. Or the results, Michael added with a wink. No KPIs and file shuffling, right? Jason exhaled slowly through his nose. He took a measured sip of water, the glass cool against his palm. A man from across the table, one of Stephen's golf buddies, leaned in. I knew a guy like you, joined the military, did the desk stuff, retired early, great pension. Not bad if you're into that kind of routine. His wife giggled. Do you actually see combat or just, schedule it? More laughter. Jason looked around the table. No one stopped it. Not Linda, who was already smiling back at Michael. Not Stephen, who was now talking to someone else about tax exemptions on commercial properties. Not even Danielle, who wasn't there tonight, still on deployment. He was alone at a table full of people who believed they knew him. He was a punchline. The weight settled differently this time. It wasn't just a bruise, it was a fracture. A slow internal shift, not loud, not dramatic, but something inside Jason began to crack. He stared down at his napkin fingers brushing over the edge. The conversation floated above him, now detached. The table had moved on. Michael was recounting a business deal gone awry in Miami, drawing guffaws and head shakes. The crowd had rallied around him again. Jason sat perfectly still. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even angry, not in the way anger usually arrived, sharp, defensive. This was colder, older, the kind of pain that had been layered quietly over years, now pressing against the surface with steady, unbearable pressure. He remembered something Sam had told him once after a particularly difficult debriefing overseas. You don't have to explain your worth to people who've never bothered to see you. At the time, he'd nodded. Tonight, the words came back like a whisper. He glanced down the table again at Michael, basking in the attention, at Linda, glowing in the reflected light of her eldest son, at Stephen, nursing a drink like a man whose pride had long been outsourced. And Jason sat there in full uniform, freshly returned from a mission that had saved lives, including the life of Michael's own daughter. None of them knew. None of them asked. They didn't care. Not because they were cruel, but because they had never tried to understand him. Not really. They saw a placeholder, an extra chair, a military title that meant boring, irrelevant safe. Jason had stopped expecting more a long time ago, but expectation and ache were different things. The ache was still here. He looked down the length of the table once more, then at the door. And somewhere deep inside he made a quiet decision, not the kind you announce, not the kind that shows up in a toast, but the kind that rewrites the way you let yourself be treated. That night, Jason didn't argue. He didn't lash out or make a speech. He finished his drink, waited for dessert, and stayed until the last guest left. But in his heart, something had changed, and once it changed, it would not be undone. The evening was winding down. The last of the desserts had been cleared, and small groups of guests were beginning to gather their things. The party had become a muted hum of polite goodbyes, clinking dishes, and the rustling of coats. Jason stood near the corner of the room, quietly excusing himself from a bland conversation with a neighbor about tax returns. He'd had enough. He didn't say goodbye to Michael. He didn't seek out Stephen or Linda. He moved with practiced grace, unnoticed as always, ready to slip out the same way he'd entered, quietly, invisibly. But then, just as his hand touched the doorknob, the sound rang out, sharp and unexpected. Ding-dong. The doorbell echoed through the house, heads turned, conversations paused. Linda, puzzled, tilted her head toward the foyer. Who could that be at this hour? Before anyone could answer, the front door creaked open, and there she stood. Danielle, dressed in full flight uniform, medals gleaming faintly on her chest, her dark hair pulled neatly beneath her cap. Her posture was rigid, formal, and her eyes locked onto Jason the moment she stepped inside. The room went still. Even Michael, mid-conversation, froze. Danielle walked with purpose, step by step across the hardwood floor, the heels of her boots tapping with rhythmic finality. She came to a full stop 3 feet in front of Jason, and then she saluted. A crisp military salute held perfectly, her chin high, her voice unwavering. Major Jason Collins, United States Intelligence Command. The room gasped. Thank you for saving my crew. Silence. Thick, unbroken. Jason blinked. Danielle's voice didn't falter. 2 months ago, over Kandahar airspace, my squadron was diverted from a confirmed hostile intercept because of classified satellite recon data. We were briefed afterward that the operative responsible had overruled a standing flight path based on preemptive analysis. She lowered her salute but remained at attention. I requested to see the source. I wanted to thank them in person. It took clearance paperwork time. I found out yesterday, and when I realized it was you, I couldn't wait. Jason stood very still. He hadn't expected this. Not here, not now. Behind him, chairs scraped. Stephen had dropped his glass. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Michael's expression cracked confusion first, then something more vulnerable, disbelief. Danielle turned to face them. "If it weren't for Major Collins," she said, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd, "I and 6 other pilots would not be standing today." He saw what no one else did. He acted before anyone else would. "I owe my life to him." Then she turned back to Jason. "Thank you, sir." Jason's eyes softened. Slowly, deliberately, he returned the salute. "I was just doing my job, Lieutenant." The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was reverent. No one knew what to say, no one laughed, no one clapped, because in that moment something tectonic had shifted. Michael looked like someone seeing his brother for the first time, not the background figure in old family photos, not the quiet guest at the end of the table, but a man who had shaped history, saved lives, altered the fate of people he loved without ever demanding recognition. Stephen cleared his throat but said nothing. He sat down slowly as if the air had grown heavier. Linda's eyes were wet. She opened her mouth then closed it again. Danielle stepped closer and, breaking protocol, embraced Jason. It was quick, respectful, but genuine. Jason barely returned the hug, his arms uncertain. But his face told the story. Years of silence, of being unseen, began to fracture. Not completely, not all at once. But enough. He wasn't invisible anymore. As the guests began whispering, as the ripple of realization moved through the room, Jason remained where he was, not in the shadows, not along the edges, but in the center. Danielle stood beside him. No longer just his niece, but the bridge between 2 generations, the voice that finally said out loud what had been true all along. That Jason Collins was not just a soldier. He was the hero they never saw coming. The house was quieter now. Most of the guests had left, still murmuring in amazement at what they'd witnessed. A handful remained politely pretending to chat, but really watching Jason, glancing, whispering, recalibrating what they thought they knew. Jason stood by the mantel, sipping from a glass of water. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even basking in vindication. He was still, steady, like always. Michael finally walked over. He looked different. Not physically, he still had that expensive haircut, the pressed shirt, but something in his posture had softened. Gone was the smirking confidence. In its place was a hesitancy Jason hadn't seen since they were kids. "Well," Michael said, clearing his throat, "guess I underestimated my little brother." Jason turned to him, not unkind, but not smiling. "You did," he said, "for a lifetime." Michael opened his mouth, then shut it again. He let out a shaky laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't know," he said. "None of us did." Jason nodded once. "You never asked." There was no anger in his voice. That almost made it worse. Michael glanced around. Linda was sitting down now, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked pale. Stephen had disappeared into the kitchen, suddenly very interested in stacking leftover dishes. "You've been doing this all along," Michael said, "all that time you came home. We thought you were just pushing paper." Jason didn't reply. Michael fumbled. I was just trying to keep things light. I didn't mean half the crap I said." Jason raised an eyebrow. You didn't mean it, but you meant for people to hear it. That's the difference. Michael winced. Jason took another sip of water, letting the silence stretch before continuing. I don't need your praise, Michael. I needed your respect years ago. Michael nodded slowly. You're right. He looked at his brother, not with rivalry this time, not with performance, but with something closer to recognition. And maybe regret. I used to think I had to be the loudest guy in the room to win, he said. Turns out, you were doing the hard stuff, quietly, without ever needing a stage. Jason said nothing. Michael shifted awkwardly. I was jealous, I think, of you. The way you stayed in your lane, the way you didn't bend for anyone's approval. I always bent and then blamed everyone else when it wasn't enough. The honesty came too late, and they both knew it. Jason nodded slowly. I don't hate you, Michael. Michael looked relieved until Jason added, but I don't trust you. Not yet. Michael swallowed. Fair. Jason looked out the window toward the darkened yard, now scattered with empty wine glasses and crumpled napkins. You wanted to be seen, he said. So did I. We just chased it differently. A long silence passed between them. Michael finally said, Do you think we can fix this? Jason shrugged. Maybe. But it won't happen over drinks or one nice phone call. It'll take time. Respect isn't an apology, it's how you behave when no one's watching. Michael nodded again. I'll try. Jason didn't promise anything back, and that was okay. Later that night, Michael called. He didn't leave a voicemail, just let it ring once and hung up. Jason saw the missed call, stared at it for a long moment, then put the phone down. Forgiveness would come when it was ready. Sometimes healing meant closing the door not with anger but with intention, not to punish, but to protect. Jason didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to his brother, not to his parents, not to the family who had never asked, never seen. He had been seen now, not by the ones he'd sought all his life, but by someone who mattered, by Danielle, by himself. And that finally was enough. It had been a week since the night of the salute. Jason had returned to base, immersing himself in his routine morning briefings, classified meetings, quiet hours behind secure servers. He wasn't avoiding anyone, but he also wasn't seeking closure. That moment at the party had given him enough clarity to move forward. Then came the unexpected appointment on his calendar. Visitor access requested Michael Collins and Lieutenant Danielle Collins. He stared at the screen for a few seconds before confirming the meeting. He didn't know what to expect. He only knew that if Danielle was involved, it wasn't going to be casual. The visitor center was cool and impersonal, standard military decor, beige walls, vending machines. A few chairs bolted to the floor. Jason waited at one of the tables, his uniform crisp posture relaxed but attentive. The door buzzed. Danielle entered first. She was in uniform again, her stride confident but respectful. Behind her was Michael, jacket unbuttoned, clearly nervous, clearly out of place in this world of protocol and formality. Major Collins, Danielle said with a smile. Thank you for seeing us. Jason nodded. Lieutenant, Mr. Collins. Michael managed a half smile. Can I sit? Jason gestured to the chairs. You're already here. Danielle sat across from him. Michael followed suit, adjusting his posture awkwardly like someone unsure of the rules in a game they never learned to play. There was a beat of silence before Michael spoke. I didn't come here to make speeches, he began, or to fix things overnight. I came because I realized I've never really tried to understand you, and I want to start. Jason didn't reply. He let the space stay open, forcing Michael to continue not out of cruelty but out of clarity. I've spent years thinking success was about visibility, Michael said. Recognition, applause. And when you didn't chase those things, I thought it meant you had nothing to show for yourself. But I was wrong. He looked Jason directly in the eye for the first time. I didn't understand the military. I still don't, not fully. But Danielle helped me see what sacrifice looks like, what duty looks like, and what it means to show up every day without needing a spotlight. Jason's face remained neutral, but his fingers folded neatly on the table tensed slightly. Danielle leaned forward. Uncle Jason, I used to think strength was about being the loudest in the room. But you showed me what quiet courage looks like, what restraint, precision, and integrity look like. You saved us because you did your job without ego, and that inspired me more than anything else could have. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were shining. Jason looked at her for a long moment. I never wanted recognition, he said, but I wanted to be seen. There's a difference. Michael nodded slowly. That's what I missed. Jason turned to him. You didn't just miss it, you mocked it. For years. Michael lowered his head. I know. Danielle glanced between them, then placed something gently on the table, a framed photo of her squadron smiling and safe on the tarmac after the mission. In the bottom corner she had written in pen, to the one who watched over us from the shadows, DC. Jason stared at it. Something softened in his eyes. I didn't save you alone, he said. There was a whole team behind that call. Danielle smiled. But you made the call. You took the responsibility. That matters. Michael cleared his throat. I've got a lot to learn, Jason, but I came here to say I'm sorry. Not just for what I said, but for never bothering to understand who you are. Jason looked at him carefully. I don't need your apology to move forward, he said. But I appreciate that you're here. Michael looked stunned but grateful. Danielle stood. We'll let you get back to work. But I meant what I said. I joined this path because of people like you. Jason finally smiled, a small, quiet smile. Then I guess I did something right. As they left, Jason remained at the table for a few moments longer. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just acknowledged. And sometimes that's what healing looks like. Not a hug, not a dramatic reconciliation, but a quiet seat at the table, and someone finally saying, I see you. The light inside the command center was dim, filtered through layers of digital maps and coded briefings. Jason sat at his usual terminal, eyes scanning streams of satellite data. Another mission was forming, this one no less complex than the last. Across from him, Sam Mitchell leaned back in her chair and stretched. How's the family, she asked, not teasing, not probing, just gently curious. Jason allowed himself a small smile. Still complicated, he said, but I'm done proving. Sam grinned. That's progress. They returned to their work. Later, as the afternoon slowed, Sam pulled out an old folder filled with printed photos. Missions from years past, desert sunsets, heat maps, blurry action shots, blood-streaked uniforms, and quiet victories. Memories no one celebrated, but they remembered. Jason looked at one photo longer than the others himself, and Sam, fresh out of their first major operation, too tired to stand, but grinning anyway. Before he could speak, his inbox pinged. Subject: a question from your father. Jason opened the message slowly. It was from Stephen. Short, direct, and completely unexpected. Jason, if you have time, I'd like to understand more about what you actually do. Jason stared at the screen. Then he opened a new message. He wrote, not to impress, not to prove, but to tell the truth. About the years Stephen had missed. The risks, the failures, the moments of doubt, the reasons he stayed. He didn't know if Stephen would ever fully understand, but that wasn't the point anymore. He understood himself. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Exactly 1 month later, under the soft amber lights of the base's rec room, Jason hosted a dinner. It wasn't extravagant, just a few folding tables draped in dark green linen, a playlist humming old blues through the speakers, and a modest spread of food from the mess hall that somehow tasted better surrounded by trust. He invited only a few people. Sam Mitchell, of course, with her irreverent humor and sharp eyes that had seen him at his worst. A handful of teammates, those who had walked beside him through unspoken hell. And Danielle. Michael and Linda weren't there. Not because they didn't ask, but because Jason hadn't invited them. Instead, they had sent letters, handwritten, honest, apologetic in ways that didn't ask for redemption, only acknowledgement. Jason appreciated them even if he wasn't ready to reply. Danielle arrived in uniform carrying a small box. "I thought you should have this," she said, placing it in Jason's hands. Inside was a photo of the two of them taken the week after the mission, her in flight gear, him still in uniform, both unsmiling but somehow more connected than most families ever were. Next to the photo sat a metal badge, the insignia of her flight squadron. "Official thank you from the team," she said. "We wanted you to know." Jason didn't say much, just nodded, but his eyes softened. Later, as everyone lifted their glasses for a toast, Sam stood and cleared her throat. "To those who save quietly," she said, raising her drink, "and to those who finally see it." Jason looked around the room, faces he trusted, laughter that asked for nothing, presence that felt like home. He smiled. This wasn't a grand dining hall. There were no name cards, no heirloom china. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a visitor. This table, this room was family. And sometimes that's all we need, to be seen, to be known, and finally to belong.